Set-driven key is a really powerful tool set in Maya that allows you to control keyable attributes of an object with other keyable attributes. And those can be either on that same object or they can be on another object. Today I'm going to show you a quick way to simplify squash and stretch using set-driven key. In our previous example, we used squash and stretch on the ball, and the way we did that is we changed the values of the scale channels. So we would scale the ball up and we'd scale the other channels in order to create a stretch, or we would scale the ball down and we'd scale the other channels out in order to create a squash. So what we need to do is we need to start by creating another control attribute, and we can do that over here in the channel box. You can see I've got my ball, squash, and stretch object selected. So I'm just going to go over here to Edit. I'm going to go down here to Add Attribute, and you can see the Add Attribute box comes up. We're just going to go ahead and call this attribute squash underscore stretch. And we're going to set the minimum value to -10. We'll set the maximum value to 10. I'll talk about that a little bit later. We want to make sure that our value is set to float. We want to make sure our attribute is set to keyable. And we'll just hit OK. When you do that, you can see that it creates this squash stretch attribute on the squash and stretch node. And we'll go ahead and create our set-driven key now. So in order to do that, we want to make sure that our menu system is set to animation. We'll go over here to key. We'll go down to set-driven key and go to set. You can see it brings up the set-driven key window. And you have two panels. The top is the driver, that is the thing that is going to control. And then the driven, that is the thing that is going to be controlled. This can be the same object. So you can see it's already loaded the ball, squash, and stretch in the driven box. So we'll just go ahead with it selected, and we'll go ahead and load our driver. So both of these are going to be the same, but the channels will be different. We want the channel that's going to be driving the squash and stretch to be this new attribute we created, squash stretch. And we want the channels that are going to be driven to be scale X, scale Y, and scale Z. You can select all three of those using the Shift key. We've already created a neutral state where squash and stretch is set at 0, which is our neutral state for that attribute. And scale X, Y, and Z are all set at 1. So what we want to do is we want to set a neutral key. With squash stretch highlighted and with the scale attributes selected, you can go ahead and hit key, and you can see when you hit key down here in the channel or in the graph editor, it creates some type of key here where you can see scale X, scale Y, and scale Z have been keyed. It also turns the channels over here in the channel box blue, indicating that it's being controlled by set-driven key. So what we're going to do is we're going to set two extents. We're going to set the bottom extent or the lowest extent that that attribute can go to, and then the highest extent. So we'll start by changing this squash and stretch to -10. And you can see nothing happens because we haven't set any additional keys. But now we're going to go ahead and change these scale values. We'll go ahead and change scale Y. This is going to be our squash. So we'll set that to -0.3. And we'll set scale X to 3 and scale Z to 3. And just like when we were doing it by hand, you can see that when we scaled the object down, it's going to get wider and deeper. And with that selected, we've already set those three values. We still have the channels selected over here in set-driven key window, so we'll just hit key. Now that you've created two keys, you can click on the squash stretch attribute, middle mouse button click in the window in Maya, and you can see that when you move that up and down, that it's going to change the squash and stretch of the ball without having to key the individual scale channels. Let's go ahead and reset this to 0, and you can see when we do that, because we set that neutral key, it returns the values of the sphere to 1. So now we're just going to go ahead and set the upper extent. We'll set this to 10. And when we do that, we're going to do the opposite values. So scale Y is going to go all the way to 3, scale Z is going to 0.3, and scale X is going to 0.3. So now the ball is tall and thin. And we'll just go over here and click key. So now you've created 3 keys. If you select these channels here, you can see that it creates those keys as animation curves in the graph editor. When we click on squash stretch and set it back to 0, you can see when we click on this now, middle mouse button drag in the window, that it's going to make our ball taller and thinner, or it's going to make them wider and fatter. So what you've done essentially is you've automated squash and stretch to this one attribute, makes it simple, makes it efficient, and allows you to control the squash and stretch of the ball without the complicated keying of the scale channels. Let's go ahead and close this down. we're going to go ahead and select these channels in the channel box, and we'll right click on them and go down here to lock selected. That's going to make sure that we don't overkey or break those connections. The last thing we want to do is we want to select these curves down here in the graph editor, and we want to make these channels linear. When we actually key this squash stretch attribute, we want those keys to be the movement of the object and how slow it moves into. When we key this channel squash and stretch, we want that to be controlling the movement and squash of the ball in terms of our timing. We want the values to be linear, so down here we want to make sure that these keys are linear, these curves are linear. So now you've created squash and stretch on the ball using a single attribute and set-driven key. I hope that helps you to better understand the concept and implementation of set-driven key in Maya. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and look for our next tip.